I'm incredibly grateful and honored to have the opportunity to be part of the amazing space that CLIP created, that I've heard about for so many years from so many of my comrades in struggle, and I'm so excited to be here. I'm also, and to have been asked to join this really amazing closing plenary. But I'm also mindful and frankly enraged that I'm able to do it as, that I'm doing so because even though I'm a formerly undocumented immigrant from Canada, my comrade and sister was excluded at the border, as so many people of color have been, by the colonizer government that claims power over this land, and that neither of us was in a position to request permission from the original inhabitants of this land and the stewards of this land, who have been decimated by the same colonizing forces and denied sovereignty over their lives and their territory. So I really want to begin my time by honoring the indigenous and original peoples of this land and send solidarities across borders and across oceans to Sylvia, who couldn't be here and couldn't access this incredible space today. So I'm here to talk about queer injustice, the criminalization of LGBT people in the United States. I want to acknowledge not only that some of you out there have already heard this, but or some of what I have to say, but most of all that some of what I have to say is very much drawn from, inspired by, and points to the work of many, many, many individuals and organizations who are here in this room and at this conference and who you've had the great fortune to hear from firsthand. But basically, the central premise of my work and of this book that happened to have just come out and of my organizing and of the folks I organize with is that the policing of sex and gender and the punishment of perceived nonconformity, sexual nonconformity and gender nonconformity is instrumental and has been instrumental to the colonization and continued colonization of this land, of the colonization of Africa, the kidnapping of African peoples, the dragging them through the horrors of the Middle Passage, and the institution of chattel slavery and maintenance of chattel slavery in this country, and the exclusion of people of color at its borders. And that it's really been the policing and punishment of sexual and gender nonconformity has been instrumental to the rise of the prison industrial complex in the United States, and of the mass incarceration of people of color in the prisons of this country, and the mass social control of people of color on the streets and in our communities. It's also an independent function of law enforcement. I really strongly believe law enforcement is also inherently set up to police the lines between what is termed male and what is termed female, and is set up to police the lines of any perceived deviation from hetero-patriarchal reproductive sexual activity that is condoned and valued by the state. And that is a central independent function of law enforcement, but that it doesn't mean isolated targeting of queers, that always takes place against a backdrop of larger political, social, and economic systems in this country. It's something that began when Columbus first set foot on these shores and projected wholesale images of sexual deviance and gender nonconformity on the multiplicity of indigenous peoples who inhabited this land, and that did not begin when the pilgrims of this area or who colonized this area enacted sodomy laws, and it didn't end when those sodomy laws were struck down by the Supreme Court in 2003. That it's continued and through a straight line from that moment that Christopher Columbus first landed, straight alongside the often selective enforcement of sodomy laws, which, like any other law, disproportionately targeted people of color and people who the law was designed to control, police, and punish, but has continued alongside it and certainly continues beyond it. So, and it continued and through other systems. I think we talk about policing and punishment, and we tend to think of police and prisons, but it also manifests through immigration systems. So, for instance, my sister was denied entry at the border as part of a long history of Asian women being denied entry at the border of this country specifically and explicitly on the grounds of perceived sexual deviance and perceived gender deviance. The first immigration law passed in this country excluded Chinese women on the grounds that they were prostitutes, inherently. So that's part of a very long So it happens through immigration enforcement. It happens through the U.S. military's activities in enacting colonization, in maintaining the reservation system, and it happens through ongoing policing at Custom and Border Protection, and also through various multiple alphabet agencies at federal, state, and local levels. It happens, I tend to focus on how police do it because, to me, the police are the front line of the state, and they're often the point of first encounter. They're not the only point of first encounter with the criminal legal system or the prison industrial complex, but they often are the first point of encounter, and that gives them. They also have tremendous power. I think someone doesn't just show up in prison. Someone puts them there, and often it's the decision of a law enforcement officer as to who to watch, who to surveil, who to stop, who to talk to, who to search, who to arrest, what to charge them with. That really makes it such that one encounter with a law enforcement officer can literally change your entire life. And that, to me, locates them as a critical place of struggle. And the tools that give them power to do that, the laws that give them power to do that, a critical place of focusing on how criminalization of LGBT people happens in the U.S. And one of the main ways I see it happening is through the implementation of something called quality of life policing, which is premised on this notion. We've heard a lot about the war on drugs as one way in which it happens. And quality of life policing is sort of this broader notion that basically it's incumbent that we need to control bodies in public spaces, and we need to maintain social order. Like, it's literally called order maintenance policing. And it happens by enacting very specific laws governing public conduct in public spaces, sleeping in public, eating in public, urinating in public, existing in public, standing in public. But then given how many people engage in those activities, they're discriminatorily enforced. So the middle-class commuter who falls asleep on the train on the way home from work is not ticketed for sleeping on the train. It's the homeless LGBTQ youth of color who is sleeping on the train because there is nowhere else to sleep, who's ticketed repeatedly for sleeping on a train. And then there's these very vague laws, like disorderly conduct, lewd conduct, loitering, which really means standing in a public space. Literally. Disorderly conduct means whatever the cop says it means. And literally there are ways in which we all know that applies to people of color in public spaces. Those kinds of laws stem directly from black codes and vagrancy laws that have been enforced against people of color's presence in public space since the foundation of this country. But they also apply in ways that are about policing and punishment of sexual and gender nonconformity. So often a police officer, literally, if they look at you and they can't figure out what box, because there's only two boxes, right? Male and female, and there's a certain set of behaviors and appearances that go with that. If they can't put you in their mind in one of those boxes, or when they're taking your ID or whatever, then literally, intentionally or unintentionally, they read you as disorderly. And they literally write you a ticket for disorderly conduct. So regardless of what you're actually doing in public spaces, you are immediately perceived as someone to be watched, to be surveilled, to be contained, to be policed, and to be arrested for being disorderly. Sexual and gender nonconformity is often read as sexual nonconformity, and therefore people will also experience ticketing for lewd conduct, or, as we've so often heard and as is so deeply entrenched, loitering for the purposes of prostitution or some prostitution-related offense. And that produces, and that kind of, the things that motivate those things, the perceptions that LGBT folks literally represent, particularly LGBT folks of color, literally represent disorder in public spaces that must be contained, that we literally represent mental instability, inherent potential for violence, inherent potential for sexual predation, inherent potential for bringing in activities that then produce larger, that literally undermine the fabric of our society, those kinds of things that happen in the context of policing and that inform policing under this quality of life policing, then continue to reproduce themselves in courts where we're seen as inherently dishonest, as inherently guilty of engaging in any sexual crime, as inherently untrustworthy, and inherently about disrupting the natural order of things. And then it is punished deeply and profoundly in the nation's prisons through placement in sex-segregated facilities and the way in which that is done, through endemic physical and sexual violence that is inherent to the prison industrial complex, through denial of basic human rights, medical treatment, and treatment of folks, and literal policing and punishment of sexual and gender nonconformity inside prisons. So that's not my best presentation of it, because it was certainly short and last minute. Fortunately, I had some time to think about it and write it down properly. But one question that we posed ourselves when we were doing that work was, what does everything that I just said and everything that we know in our bodies and in our communities mean for our movements for liberation? What does that mean in terms of bringing the revolution home? It means that the criminalization of LGBT people in this country is a national emergency. And it needs to be addressed as such, not only by LGBTQ movements like the gay stream, but by LGBTQ movements for liberation. That there are things that happen in the context of policing and punishment of sexual and gender nonconformity against members of our communities who are excluded and marginalized in the gay stream, that if they happen in any other context would produce just tremendous outrage, where literally people will stand up in courts and say, she should die because she's a hardcore lesbian. He should die because he's an avowed homosexual. She should not be believed because he's a man telling you that he's a she. Things like that, he should get psychological counseling because he was cruising in the park. Those things happen in criminal courts, but because the LGBT gay stream movement has framed distance from criminality as a precondition to equality, this is not termed a national emergency, and it needs to be termed a national emergency. It also means that economic justice is an LGBT issue, because it's economic issues that drive that place people in the crosshairs of the criminal legal system and criminalize the activities that we engage in for survival. It means that secure communities is an LGBT issue. It's because under secure communities is a new immigration, not new, but it's an immigration program that basically would allow police to send the fingerprints they pick up from anyone who's arrested directly to ICE before any judge has ever even decided whether the cop had any reason to pick you up. So in other words, in 3 years under ESCOM, and I hate to be depressing, but this is why it's a national emergency for me, in 3 years under ESCOM, every undocumented LGBTQ person of color in this country is going to be in immigration proceedings, unless we stand up as queer folks and say ESCOM is a national emergency for queers. It means that we need to work with LGBTQ young people of color and adults of color to really provide harm reduction tools in terms of dealing with the criminal legal system. Not reforming the criminal legal system, it's not reformable. It's set up to harm us, to police us, to punish us. But to give folks, so the organization I work with, Streetwise and Safe, gives LGBTQ youth of color harm reduction tools to deal with the criminal legal system, while at the same time trying to create space for them to be able to, thank you. It's time to stop talking, to be able to demand responses that address their realities. And it also means a number of other things that I will talk about in response to questions.